Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the education section. So in this video I'm going to discuss maximising hamstring development. First of all, how to train the hamstring, what the hamstring's made up of, what joints it cross, etc. Just so we've got an understanding of what basically the action of the hamstring is, so that we can then have a look, right, what can we consider when it comes to exercise selection and how do we then perform those exercises, as well as some common mistakes and pitfalls I see when it comes to training the hamstrings. So to start off, we're going to touch on the role and anatomy as I touched on. So when it comes to the hamstrings, there are a biarticular muscle, which basically means it crosses over two joints. And as a result, it influences two joints. It crosses over the hip and the knee. And as a result, it has two roles. So one of the roles is hip extension, the other role is knee flexion. So by hip extension, I mean going from like a bent over position to upright. An example would be like doing a deadlift, just picking something off the ground really, when you're going from bent at the hips to straight at the hips. Similar to maybe even a squat, we go through obviously hip flexion and extension to an extent, just to a lesser degree. And also knee flexion, so basically bending the knee. So when we go from our knee being straight to our knee being bent, that is our hamstring basically carrying out that action. Granted, it's under load. So the hamstrings are comprised of three muscles, which are the bicep femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. So you don't need to know these exact names of the muscles, but all you need to know is the hamstring crosses over two joints, hip and the knee, and its roles are hip extension and knee flexion. All parts of the hamstring cross over these two joints, which basically means they all carry out that role. Whereas when it comes to the quads, for example, not all parts of the quad start and end in the same region, if that makes sense. So they have different, one part of the quad has a different role, if that makes sense. Whereas the hamstring, all parts of the hamstring will have kind of the same role and same effect when we're doing movements. And just so you kind of have the understanding of the hamstring at different lengths, so obviously you can stretch a muscle or lengthen a muscle and then shorten a muscle or squeeze a muscle. For example, lengthen bicep, shorten bicep. So when we are training the hamstring, a fully lengthened hamstring is when our leg is straight and our hip is flexed, or we're bent at the hips. Think about a bottom of a straight leg deadlift, or when you stretch to touch your toes. Whereas a fully shortened hamstring would be an extended hip and a flexed knee. Example is like a lying hamstring curl. That's relatively close to being fully shortened. So what does this actually tell us in practice? How is this valuable to be aware of? So when training a muscle, we want to basically take the origin closer to the insertion. That's kind of how we train a muscle through a full range, which is typically going to result in the best muscle growth, if that makes sense. Therefore, we want to take our knee from being straight to fully bent when we're training knee flexion, and take our hip from being bent to extended to train hip extension, and therefore the hamstring. So pretty much this summarised is perform hamstring curls and hip hinge variations independently. The reason why we want to do it independently is, mind I said that our hamstring crosses over two joints. So if, let's say, we're bending our leg but straightening the hip at the same time, I don't know how you'd manage this, but let's say you are, or well, to be fair, you can during like a squat, for example. The length isn't actually changing a lot, which I'll get to, so you're not taking it through a full range and it's not working an awful lot. So next up, we're going to touch on exercise selection. That's if the slides load. So first of all, we're going to touch on hip flexion. So yeah, we want to train both independently. Some exercises you can train hip flexion could be a barbell RDL, a barbell stiff leg deadlift. Any other deadlift variation, a hyperextension, which is basically when you are slanted, you've got your lower body locked in and you're basically extending at the hips. And it could be like a pit shark or machine RDL of some sort. A good morning. Basically anything else where you go a large degree of hip flexion, where there's a challenge to the hips, and everything else relatively still is going to be a good movement to target the hamstring. Saying that, like, some movements are better than others, the ones I've listed, for example. And what I mean by that is, like, a deadlift variation, if you do a conventional deadlift or a sumo deadlift, you're not getting as much stretch in your hamstrings, and you're using other muscle groups as well. So typically, if hamstrings are a weakness in a main area of focus, a barbell RDL or a stiff leg deadlift, or maybe like a good morning would be best, or like an RDL on a machine, etc. But yeah, these movements allow us to train hamstrings in more of its middle and lengthened position of the muscle length, and more so when our legs relatively straight and we're bent at the hips, we're going to get like a greater stretch on our hamstrings, if that makes sense. So in terms of movements that can train knee flexion, so bending the knee, meaning knee flexion, is like seated hamstring curl, a lying hamstring curl, standing hamstring curls. You've got obviously like a dumbbell hamstring curl, and also you could even do like a cuffed cable hamstring curl and a Nordic curl. Basically, my favourites are kind of like a seated hamstring curl and a lying hamstring curl. The reason being is the seated hamstring curl, you're really stable. You train it in quite a appropriate position, getting a lot of stretch at the top, which is conducive to muscle growth. Lying hamstring curl, not too bad an option. You're not quite as stable and locked in. And then when it comes to standing hamstring curl, just due to when you're on a lying hamstring curl, since you're lying on the machine, you've got some element of the weight pushing you down, your body weight pushing down on the seat, which will grant you stability. Whereas the standing hamstring curl, you've not obviously got that because of gravity pushing you down and not into the pad, so you're not as stable, which is why I wouldn't really recommend the standing hamstring curl. And typically the tension's really hard at the top and not enough at the bottom, which is a downside. You've got like a dumbbell hamstring curl, like a cuffed cable hamstring curl and a Nordic curl. Typically they are not ones I'll use, because with a dumbbell hamstring curl you don't have hands as feet, so it's hard to hold on to the dumbbell when you're performing it. With a cable hamstring curl, you're not quite as stable and locked in, it's a pain to set up. And with a Nordic curl, you need to worry about what the rest of your body's doing and keeping like your core really tight in that. There's a lot more moving parts, if that makes sense. But typically, these movements will allow us to train our hamstrings in the middle and shortened position of a muscle length, except from kind of like the seated hamstring curl, where you'll get maybe a bit less of a shortened hamstring, or fully squeezed hamstring, is a good way to put it. You won't get as great a contraction, the muscle won't get short. So in terms of executing exercises, when it comes to hip hinges, we want to think about driving our hips back, maintaining a neutral spine, a soft bend at the knee if hamstring growth is the goal. We don't want, apart from obviously maybe initiating the movement, we don't want a ton of bend in the knee or in the leg. The reason being is the goal when we're training our hamstrings is what's happening at the hips when we're doing a hip hinge. We don't want to bend the knee further, because that's going to encourage the quad to work. So we want enough knee bend to obviously work our hamstrings effectively, but apart from that, we don't want to have excessive bend in the knee. So we want to keep it relatively stable. And we want to get as much range of motion as we need before we need to bend our knees or flex our spine to get any lower, basically bend our back. And this will basically, what we want to do when we're doing it as well is, like, the reason we want to maintain a neutral spine is when our spine goes into flexion, like, we're not getting any more length for the hamstring, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is, if we fully stretch the hamstring, then how's going any lower going to help us train the hamstring further? It's already fully stretched. So in that case, it's a case of driving our hips through and forward to kind of complete that movement. And in terms of what else we want to focus on is keeping the bar relatively close so it maintains under a centre of gravity. So basically we don't fall forward and don't have like a lot of stability, which will help us lift more if we've got stability. And we also want to create tension throughout our back before pulling. So what I'll do when I'm doing a RDL or any deadlift variation is, I'll basically, obviously my hands are going to be in the bar, but what I'll basically do is I'll focus on twisting my hands like this, so my elbows face back, like I'm almost trying to bend the bar, and also taking a breath in through my belly, slightly lifting my chest just to create as much stability as I can, or as much tightness as I can through my core, through my back and through my upper body as a whole. The reason why I twist the bar or focus on driving my elbows back is that will engage your lats,